warm word of welcome to all of you who are joining this event from all different parts of the world this evening. I think we will have a moment later to possibly acknowledge a few special guests who are participating tonight, but please may I just, I'm going to ask Klaus Krishok from the Goethe Institute in Johannesburg. He's our regional director, and Ambassador Schaefer from the German Embassy in South Africa, and Tali Nates from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center to say a few words of welcome. After that, I will hand over to Professor Gruner for the keynote address. And after that, there will be time for questions, which will be moderated by Mary Clook. And so without further ado, please may I first of all welcome, to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Goethe Institute, Klaus Krishok, the director of the Goethe Institute in Sub-Saharan Africa. Klaus, you've got the microphone.
Thank you very much, François. Erev Tov, good evening and guten Abend, everyone, to all of us watching us from South Africa, from Canada, from the US, and many other places I can't see right now. It has been a very good tradition between the Goethe Institute, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and also the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation of South Africa to stage a commemoration of the November pogroms. We've been doing this for 11 years, I believe. Tali, I believe that's correct, roughly 11 years, as long as our memory goes back. Usually the Goethe Institute hosts this event at our very own premises. And this, I guess, is the reason why I get to speak before our ambassador. So everyone, especially the international audience, please be assured that South Africans and Germans do respect diplomatic protocol, but we also do cherish our own tradition. So Ambassador Schaefer, forgive me for speaking first. I promise I'll never do it again. There you go. Obviously, all this is different this year, and it's different in a sad sense that we can't meet and eventually join after the proceedings for a glass of wine and continue the discussion. But it's also quite wonderful because I hear there's more than 400 people from across the planet joining us on this event. So quite exciting. I would like to thank Tali personally for again teaming up with us and her entire team. I know this looks very easy, but staging an event like this is more complicated than we've all anticipated, than we all thought back then in April or March when the crisis hit us. Jan Leidecker from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation as well. And of course, all our speakers, most of all our keynote speaker, Wolf Gruner, a very warm good morning to Santa Monica in the US of A. Exciting times for America these days. We all understand and we know about the historic significance of the 9th of November, 1938. We also know about the historic significance for us Germans with regards to the 9th of November in general. I have a feeling that Ambassador Schaefer might want to elaborate on that, but we'll see. Of course, this 9th of November 1938 is widely seen as the starting point of the crime, the madness, and the tragedy that later became the Holocaust. We also understand that this madness has much deeper and older roots all across Germany and across Europe. Let's remember those roots go back, way back. We had an interesting discussion amongst ourselves at the Goethe Institute and with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center just prior to the event. I'd like to quickly elaborate on that. The November pogroms are very often also entitled Kristallnacht, or even worse, Reichskristallnacht. I personally object to that, and I would be very keen to hear what Wolf Gruner has to say on that. The etymology and the origins of this euphemistic term, Kristallnacht, are unclear. It is not proven whether the Nazis invented that or whether it was popular language, especially among Berliners. To me, Kristallnacht has a very cynical undertone. It's not just the night of broken glass, it is the night of broken crystal, if you like. So what kind of connotation does crystal actually evoke in you? Is it glass, or is it something that evokes eventually even the stereotype of a rich Jewish home where crystal, the silverware, etc. was broken? The term Kristallnacht is more or less taboo in German media and in German historiography. It is, however, an established term in international communication. Interesting concept, and since Wolf Gruner will be talking about what happened to Jewish homes that night, it might be an aspect that is maybe interesting for linguists, which I am, but also interesting in the interpretation of what the November pogroms mean today. I had another interesting conversation in preparation for tonight with young South Africans, another online, one of those countless online discussions. And they were asking me, Klaus, what do you actually do? So I named a few events like this one. And those South Africans asked me, why do you actually do this? This is a thing of the past. This is something that is way back, goes way back in German history. The answer is very, very clear. It can happen anywhere and anytime. The only way we can avoid that is by keeping the memory of what happened in 1938 open. So for as long as I'm director of the Goethe Institute, Tali, rest assured, we'll team up again. And I'm sure this will be another night of insights, hopefully lively discussions, and we will discover new aspects of what happened on the 9th of November, 1938. Thank you very much. And with this, I wish the moderator and all speakers good luck. Hopefully the technology will stand the trial of a 2-hour planetary discussion, and I give back to the wonderful François.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And yes, you are quite right about the order of the protocol, but I do feel it was appropriate for you to prepare the room. But that brings me then right up to the next point, and it's always a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Martin Schaefer, the ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to South Africa. Over the last few years, we've come to know the ambassador as a real friend of South Africa and of the Holocaust Center and of the Goethe Institute. And so it's a personal pleasure, really, to introduce Dr. Martin Schaefer to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody that is with us, and a word of gratitude to all of you who choose to spend some time with us on this night of the 10th of November, 2020. And in particular, my gratitude extends to our hosts, to Klaus Krischok and François Venter of the Goethe Institute, to Tali Nates and the incredibly excellent Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and my colleague Jan Leidecker, to Professor Gruner from faraway California that I just met a couple of minutes ago before this meeting, to the Holocaust survivors present today, and in particular to my personal friend Veronica Phillips. Happy birthday, Veronica. It was yesterday, but I think it's still close enough to congratulate to you on this birthday of yours, on the fateful day of German history on the 9th of November. And I won't tell anybody how old you are. I wish to acknowledge the presence of all the representatives of Jewish organizations in South Africa. Welcome to all of you. And to all of those amongst us who uphold this great and important tradition to meet on or around the 9th of November each year to commemorate what happened on 9th of November 1938 in my home country in Germany. It gives me great joy, some relief, and a lot of hope that there are so many of you tonight who wish to share with us, to commemorate and remember and to try to understand what actually happened exactly 82 years ago. Actually, my task is nearly impossible, as I am asked to speak to you about the 9th of November 1938, immediately before Professor Gruner, one of the most renowned experts worldwide on the Shoah and also the infamous Pogrom-Nacht. So please forgive me for not daring to venture into the fateful, violent, and traumatic events of that day and night all across Germany. I am not a historian, and I do not strive to compete with Professor Gruner in his field of excellence, even as I am tempted, as maybe some of you are also, to engage in my amateurish attempts to do just that. However, what I am is the official and the formal representative of the state, and by extension also the nation that brought about the Reichspogromnacht 82 years ago. And please allow me tonight to share just 2 points with you that come to my mind in those troubling times of today. First and foremost, and that is my first point, as the German ambassador to South Africa, and as the grandchild of the generation of Germans that is guilty of and responsible for the Holocaust, the Reichspogromnacht, all events that led up to the 9th of November 1938, and the terror that followed in the Holocaust until Allied forces, with their brute force, made us stop the killing and the inferno. I can only bow my head in shame before you and all those that suffered so terribly under German and under Nazi terror. There's no possible way to undo what was done in the name of the German nation. But I can reiterate, I can confirm, and I can repeat over and over again, tonight and evermore, that we are acutely aware of our responsibility for what happened, and for that it must never, never happen again. It is easy to say that our commemoration tonight is more important than ever. Often, I believe it is just an expression of our all too human inclination to think that our present is the most relevant moment of all in history. But today, in these troubled times, I believe it is different, and our present might indeed be a pivotal moment in history. From my personal perspective, having grown up in Protestant northern Germany and having been received with open arms by this anarchic, chaotic, but also creative and shrewd people of Berlin, I sense dangerous parallels in history. I sense the resurgence of the times of the late 20s and early 30s in Europe, of the political atmosphere in Berlin, in Munich, and so many other places in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. I sense the wish of too many to be guided rather by emotions and not by reason, to rather believe what feels right and what is unmistakably, and not what is unmistakably correct. I sense that populism, but also authoritarianism, has crept in, with politicians, media houses, and others peddling information, spreading fake news, and appealing to only bad and negative emotions. I see that the eyewitness, and first amongst them, the Holocaust survivors, have become frail, their voices much quieter than before. And I sadly realize that they will not be with us forever. I see the Hugenbergs, the von Papens, the Goerings, nowadays the big voices of the My Country First brigades that remind me of the rhetoric of the times in Berlin at the end of the 20s and the beginning of the 30s. Yes, and I sometimes even believe to see the modern day Goebbels style as it was in 1929 in the streets of Berlin. Brown shirts, black shirts, and red shirts, all ferociously convinced of their cause, deriding the rule of law and state institutions, and willing to tear it all down. There's no reason to assume that history will always repeat itself. To resign to believing that nowadays the resemblance of Berlin in 1929 and 30 would inevitably lead to something like the Machtergreifung on the 30th of January 1933, to the Kristallnacht on 9th of November 1938, and to Auschwitz. But the signs are on the wall that we need to be alert and resolute. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. In the heart of Germany, right next to the apartment, by the way, of my eldest son, Sebastian, who studies in Halle, a German tried to kill dozens of Jews celebrating Yom Kippur. Millions of people around the world, including in Germany, follow and believe ridiculous conspiracy theories and despise reason and logic. Violence and incitement to violence have become again part of the measures politicians choose in the battle for public opinion and power. And by the way, also in South Africa. The list can be endlessly prolonged. Therefore, it is now, I believe, more than ever, that we need to stand together to make sure that the signs on the wall are just that they are warning signals that make us rise to the occasion, that make us rise to defend our values and our lives in freedom and diversity with everything we have, remembering our grief and our firm conviction that we can learn from history and get it right this time 90 years later. That is a task for everyone amongst us, young or old, man or woman, white, black, or colored. And it comes down to very simple principles. In essence, this is about humanity. It is about empathy. It is about humility and courage. And maybe the best word of all, if we look at what happened and what happens now, it is about decency. Now, I'm very much looking forward to the lecture of Professor Gruner. It is fascinating to observe that still today, 4 generations after the fateful events, historians continue to discover not only new facts, but also new perspectives and sometimes a genuine new vision of what really happened and what it means for us today. I would like to thank you all for the patience with me and with my message. And I cannot possibly express with words my overwhelming feelings of gratitude. Gratitude for the miracle of reconciliation. Gratitude for the wonder of us all, Holocaust survivors, victims of the Shoah, children, grandchildren, and grand-grandchildren of victims and perpetrators alike, commemorating together, remembering what happened, and at least virtually holding our hands in humility and peace. And proclaim our vow together. We remember, never again. We remember. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Schaefer. It is always an honor and a pleasure to have you at our events and to hear you speak. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're moving on with the program. I'm now going to introduce Tali Nates. Tali is the director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and she's also the chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. I'm going to invite Tali to say a few words and then to introduce the next playing back of a candle lighting ceremony to, I suppose, ceremonially open the proceedings for tonight. Tali, thank you very, very much for everything that you've done to bring this community together, not just this event. And I hand the microphone right to you now.
Thank you very, very much, Francois. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your poignant and important words. We cherish your presence and your friendship. Our dear Holocaust survivors, German Ambassador Dr. Martin Schaefer, Director of the Goethe Institute, Klaus Krischok, representatives of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Director Jan Leidecker, our guest speaker, Dr. Wolf Gruner, Mary Clook and Heather Blumenthal, directors of the Durban and Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centers, members of the Board of Trustees, colleagues, friends. There are many teachers with us, academics, and colleagues from museums and institutions from around the world. It is wonderful to have you all with us tonight or this morning, wherever you are. The South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation is an association of the 3 Holocaust and Genocide centers in South Africa. And we are all 3 of us, are all honored to partner again with the Goethe Institute and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation to commemorate together the 82nd anniversary of the 1938 November pogrom, known to most of you, as Klaus eloquently spoke about, as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Through education and public programs, the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation's 3 centers raise awareness of Holocaust and genocide history and use this history as a platform to focus on human rights issues in contemporary society. It is our honor to partner with the Embassy of the Republic of Germany in South Africa, and together with them to launch today a short education film that will be used by all of us to teach thousands of learners and teachers about the Holocaust. It was a work that took about 8 months to get to, but the film is launched tonight. I want to quote from one of our dear late Holocaust survivors, Gita Rosi Zalmans. She was born in Hattingen, Germany, and she settled in Johannesburg after the war. Now, she gave many testimonies, and in one of them, she described in detail how she witnessed as an 11-year-old child the events of the 9th of November, 1938. And she describes it as that. It was Kristallnacht, and they started burning down the synagogue next door to us. And they jumped over the wall. We had quite a big wall. How they managed to do it, I don't know. But they jumped over and came into our house from the back. My father's dental practice was at the back of the house, overlooking a beautiful cacti garden. My father's practice was completely destroyed, and my father was arrested in the morning. He was sent to Dachau. My mother collected tea services, cups and saucers, and displayed them. After Kristallnacht, there were no longer tea services. I hated the brutes of the SS that made a very good job of my mother's tea services. Furniture was thrown over, everything was taken out of cupboards, everything was destroyed. With her father in Dachau, her mother made the most difficult decision any mother can make. She sent Gita and her 13-year-old brother, Hans Joachim, on the Kinder transport to Great Britain. In doing that, she saved their lives. Gita's parents were sent first to Theresienstadt, but then to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were murdered. And I wanted to, rather than give you facts and figures, which we will learn much more from one of the world experts, Professor Wolf Gruner, to actually bring the voice of a survivor that settled in our country. but remembered even in her old age, in her 80s, the events when she was 11 years old. So we reflect today on what many historians recognize as the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning. Because persecution using legal and Nazi ideology fueled propaganda turned on those days into violence, into terror, into murder. And that's what we are going to learn more about tonight. Of course, following Kristallnacht, the Jewish community of Germany, whoever was left, really could not stay and wanted to get out. And for those of you joining us here in Johannesburg, perhaps you wonder how many of them came to South Africa. With the quota laws and the many, many restrictions, between 1939 and 1945, only about 400 Jews, let me repeat, about 400 Jews managed to enter our country. In the following 6.5 years, Nazi persecution of the Jews moved from a policy of forced immigration to one of mass murder, culminating with the final solution and the mass murder of 6 million Jews and of course millions of other targeted victims. After Kristallnacht, American journalist Dorothy Thompson said these very famous words that we have in our permanent exhibition. And she said, "It is a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death." And those words seem as relevant today as they were in 1938. As the ambassador shared with us, the growing populism, hate speech, violent attacks, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia is all around us. And we at the 3 centers of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation as education institutions have more work to do than possibly in previous years. We are dedicated to do so, and we believe that education is key to combat hate. Usually, we have our traditional candle lighting ceremony, or we stand together for a moment of silence and reflection. This year, with COVID-19 pandemic, we couldn't do that. So we pre-recorded survivors and descendants from different backgrounds, lighting candles and sharing their short testimonies and messages, including one about the relatively unknown history of the Jewish detainees that were sent to Mauritius, the closest the Holocaust came to South Africa. They joined us from different cities in South Africa and in Israel. Lighting the candles are Holocaust survivors Ella Blumenthal from Cape Town, Dr. Ruth Siton from Israel, Irene Klaas and Helene Seif from Johannesburg, second-generation Holocaust survivor Marcel Nathan from Durban, and Rwandan survivor of the 1994 genocide, Sylvester Sendekieye from Johannesburg. The resilience and message of hope inspire us all. Thank you very much.
I, Ella Blumenthal, nie Frank, light victims of the Holocaust. I was born in 1921 in Warsaw, Poland. I survived the Warsaw Ghetto, was deported to Majdanek, and from there, my niece Roma and I were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And finally, Bergen-Belsen, where we were liberated. We were the only members of our large family who survived the Holocaust. I am 99 years old, live in Cape Town, and have 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and 10 great-grandchildren.
I, Ruth Seton Flesch, light this candle to keep the memory of the Jewish deportation to Mauritius alive. I was born in Vienna on March 1937. On 25th of March 1938, 13 days after the Anschluss, my mother, Frieda Flesch, took her life. In 1939, my father, Julius Flesch, was detained in Dachau for 3 months. His release from there was on the condition that he must leave Austria immediately. We joined a transport that was arranged by Aliyah Bet and also by Berthold Stauffer from the Jewish Center for Jewish Immigration and by the authority of the Gestapo. On September 3rd, 1940, we left Vienna on the Schönbrunn towards Tulsa in Romania, and from there on the Atlantic to Palestine. Palestine at the time was under British mandate. We escaped by minutes being on the Patria, who was sunken, and thus were deported by the British authorities to Mauritius, to the Barbarism detention camp. I was 3 years old when we arrived in Mauritius, when the British officers separated me harshly from my father's arms and moved me into the women's camp alone by myself, while the rest of the kids stayed with their mothers. I would like to pay tribute to the people who played a role in my life there during almost 5 years, which we spent in Mauritius. It was far from being paradise, especially for the adults. The harsh climate, the loss of freedom, the helplessness, the unknown future, and above all, the deep concern for all the dear ones that were left behind in the turbulent times of war, whose fate was unknown to us. I dedicate this candle to all my teachers, the doctors, the kind local Mauritian people, all trying to make life as normal and as bearable as possible. Last but not least, I would like to mention the Jewish community of South Africa, who sent us food, clothes, and above all, their warm support. This came to us in days and years we felt we were forgotten by man and God. I, Irene Klaas Niesteller, light this candle in memory of all innocent children who were murdered during the Holocaust. I was born in 1931 in Lodz, Poland, and as a child survived the Warsaw Ghetto and then pretended to be not Jewish until liberation. My father and many members of my family were murdered. Only my mother survived.
I likewise largest and honor of the artists among the nations, who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. I was born in Belgium in 1937, and Alma had to sing of the ship, who left me and treated me as one of her children. She was recognized as an artist among the nations.
I, Marcel Nathan, light this candle to honor all descendants of Holocaust survivors. I am the son of Kurt and Ruth Nathan. My father was born in Emmerich and came to South Africa in 1936, becoming a pioneer in the SA scrap metal industry. He settled in Durban. My mom was born in Brunswick, where the family lived an integrated life. In 1936, age 18, my mother was sent to London with a German family as their au pair. Her parents were concerned about the situation in Germany at the time and insisted their 3 children leave Germany. My grandparents remained in Germany and sadly perished in Theresienstadt, date unknown. Having known my mom's family in Germany, my dad began to correspond with my mom and they fell in love. My mom traveled by ship from London to Cape Town. They were married in Cape Town on her arrival in 1946, returning to Durban, where they raised a family, my sister Caroline, myself, and my late brother Raymond. We had a beautifully warm, open home. Sadly, my father passed away in 1974, age 72, and my mom in 2014, age 95. Caroline and I, our spouses, the 6 grandchildren, the 13 great-grandchildren, remember with love our parents who, despite their tragedies and challenges, lived a wonderfully full life.
I'm lighting a candle in memory of all genocide victims. I was born in 1981 in Rwanda, when genocide began on 7 April 1994. Our family went to church in the capital, hoping to find a safety. There in the church, there was no water, there was no food. So on 1 April, this year we came in the church. My father and other men tried to defend themselves against the militia, but they died fighting. My mother hid my siblings in the church, but the militia broke in and they killed everyone who was inside. I was hit over the head with large stick with nail on the side and the nail on the ground. They thought I was dead. Actually, I survived until genocide. Upon life, I got the melt and now I've got 4 children.
Thank you very, very much to everyone who participated in putting that little ceremony together, both the speakers and the technicians who filmed and put it together. Truly profound to share this experience. I'm now in the fortunate position to be able to be the person to welcome Professor Wolf Gruner to deliver the keynote address for this evening. And just before I hand over the microphone, a few words. Wolf Gruner holds the Chappelle Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies, and he's a professor of history at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, since 2008. He's the founding director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research since 2014. He is a specialist in the history of the Holocaust and in comparative genocide studies. He received his PhD in history in 1994 from the Technical University in Berlin. And he was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, Yad Vashem, Jerusalem, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Women's Christian University in Tokyo, and the Center for Jewish Studies in Berlin-Brandenburg, as well as the Desmond E. Lee Visiting Professor for Global Awareness at Webster University in St. Louis. He is the author of 10 books on the Holocaust, among them Jewish Forced Labor under the Nazis, Economic Needs, and Nazi Racial Aims. And his most recent book is The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, Czech Initiatives, German Policies, Jewish Responses. That was published in English with Berghahn in 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, I am now handing over the microphone to Wolf Gruner. Just before I do that, a reminder that if you scroll to the bottom of your Zoom page and you move your mouse up and down, you will be able to click on the chat button. And if you have any questions, which will be moderated in the session after the keynote address, you can write your question in the chat. So without further ado, it's my great honor to present to you Dr. Wolf Gruner.
Thank you so much, Francois, for the introduction. And my special thanks go to Tali Nates for to inviting me to South Africa, although unfortunately only virtually now. And my thanks also go to the 3 Holocaust and Genocide Centers hosting this event, as well as to the Goethe Institute and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. My talk touches upon a topic which is strangely overlooked, and I have to include myself here, by scholars for decades. We often thought, or until recently, we thought that the pogrom of November 1938, or also dubbed the Kristallnacht, is the best investigated event of the whole Third Reich. But now we have to recognize that our knowledge about what happened during the fateful night and the next day is still quite limited. When the pogrom is discussed either by the public or by academics, most people are emphasizing, and rightfully so, the attacks on synagogues, the vandalism against shops owned by Jews across Germany. Only some mention that also Jewish community centers, orphanages, and schools were destroyed, and much less is kind of a topic, the destruction of Jewish homes and apartments. During the last decade, some of the kind of research, mostly local research, is mentioning the destruction of Jewish homes, but often kind of more anecdotally or kind of for other purposes. So what I can say is that neither the scale of the attacks nor the intensity was ever really investigated. And also the impact this had on the Jewish population and their responses was never investigated and researched. What I will do in the following lecture is based on new sources, but also on revisited old sources, known sources. And I will first describe the scale of the attacks, second, the intensity of the violence, and finally, what impact on the Jewish population this had and how they reacted towards it. With this new evidence, I want to kind of establish this forgotten element of the pogrom of November 1938 as a basic feature of how we have to see the brutal assault onto the Jews in November 1938. So let me come to the first, the scale of the mass destruction of Jewish homes. Using the pretext of the murder of a German diplomat in Paris, Hitler and Goebbels decided to use violence as a means to drive the remaining Jews out of the country in November 1938. For the Nazi leadership, this kind of policy shift seemed necessary because they prepared to go to war very soon. First against the remaining Czech territories and then against Poland. When we look at pictures, and now let me share my PowerPoint with you. When we look at pictures of the pogrom, most of you have seen kind of photographs of attacks against synagogues or the results of it, or shops which were destroyed during the night and the next day. But photographs of the intrusion of private homes are not known, neither to the public nor to scholars. Similarly, when we look at numbers which are cited about from the pogrom, documents feature only numbers which kind of exclude the destruction of Jewish homes. So, for example, one of the most cited documents is from Reinhard Heydrich, who gave a report to high-ranking Nazi officials that 177 synagogues and 7,500 stores across the Reich had been demolished, and 35 Jews had been murdered. Later, in another document, which is also often cited, these numbers were raised by the Nazis themselves to 276 destroyed synagogues and 91 killed Jews. A document which is almost never kind of in the public eye is originating actually from the same person, Reinhard Heydrich. He submitted a first report to Hermann Göring the very next day after the pogrom. And there he mentions, next to the numbers of some synagogues and stores, also the arsoning and demolishing of 171 Jewish homes. And moreover, he emphasized in his report to Göring that these numbers would be actually much higher after more investigation. Today, scholars agree about the fact that the actual numbers of demolished synagogues are over 2,000, that the number of murdered Jews during the pogrom probably is around several hundreds, that 30,000 men were arrested and interned in concentration camps. However, we don't have any clear estimate about a figure regarding the invasion of private homes. One first indication might provide a report from the president of the German administrative district Schneidemühl, who noted on December 2nd that 16 synagogues were destroyed, 63 shops, but look at the number of destroyed departments, which is 4 times higher than the destroyed shops. Similar numbers we know now from the city Nuremberg, which confirmed these first numbers from Schneidemühl. Although the day after the pogrom, the notorious Nazi Gauleiter Julius Streicher told a mass party meeting that in his city, the demonstrations were very peaceful, generally disciplined, and clear and far-sighted. However, the reality was very different. In Nuremberg, the attackers destroyed again several synagogues, 70 shops. And here, look at the number, very similar in the relationship to the shops, 236 apartments. For the entire region around the Bavarian cities Nuremberg and Fürth, records note that almost 600 apartments and homes were demolished. In a different German town, Düsseldorf, recent research showed that more than 400 apartments were vandalized. This means in just 3 cities and 1 rural area, we have now evidence that more than 1,200 private apartments were vandalized. So when one starts to investigate the attacks on private homes, evidence quickly emerges from everywhere in Germany. We have now evidence about the destruction of homes from Cologne, Duisburg, Bochum, Essen, Oberhausen, Hagen, Königsberg, Leipzig, Chemnitz, Beuthen, Breslau, Hindenburg, just to name a few. In the Berlin, the capital of the Nazi Reich, young uniformed men burglarized countless apartments, especially in the northern and eastern part of the city. According to a survivor, quote, "The beasts pushed their way into apartments, threw the furniture out of the windows, and split open the feather beds," unquote. In Vienna, systematic raids led to the destruction of furniture, robbery of valuables, and various arsonings in 70% of the apartments. The Jewish organization The Joint reported soon after the event that in Mannheim, 90% of all homes were destroyed, and in Rostock, a city in northern Germany, all Jewish homes had been devastated. From these few numbers I gave you here, it becomes crystal clear that the total demolition of private Jewish homes was a mass phenomenon across Germany. When we extrapolate from these numbers, the actual figures of destroyed homes must have been in the thousands, if not in the tens of thousands. So the question remains, why did we know more about the destruction of apartments and Jewish homes? And during my research, I found, I think, 3 reasons. The first one was serious underreporting. Many police, stormtrooper, SS, and administrative reports from mayors only mention numbers of destroyed synagogues and Jewish shops. In cases these kind of reports mentioned the numbers of destroyed homes, they usually were sugar-coated. So for example, a report about 14 small towns in the Main region in West Germany mentioned the destruction of 5 stores and 53 Jewish homes. We know from other sources that at least one of the mayors underreported. He mentioned only 4 homes in his report, but we know that 9 Jewish homes and houses were destroyed during the pogrom of November. The second problem for the authorities was to detect the destruction, the full scale of the destruction. While police and also foreign journalists and diplomats could easily spot burning synagogues and demolished shops in the main streets of the cities, especially in big cities, the vandalized rental apartments in 4-story buildings were much harder to discover. Unless furniture was thrown out of the windows, as you can see here in this picture, mostly the destruction was hidden from plain sight. In addition, many of the demolished apartments were not reported when they were attached to either destroyed synagogues, schools, orphanages, as it happened in Krefeld, Königsburg, Erfurt, and Leipzig. The same is true when Jewish homes were attached to Jewish shops, like in Düsseldorf, where of the 400 destroyed homes, 60 were attached or located above or behind Jewish shops. For example, in Kaiserslautern, a devastated Anna Blüte recalled in a letter later how the perpetrators came with iron rods. They first destroyed the offices of her business. They cut the telephone line, demolished the desk, and broke the windows. Later, another group appeared, again with iron rods. They left no cup unbroken, no windows intact, as Anna recalled. and she said in her letter, we were outlawed. The third reason might be that there was a lack of sources. Until recently, scholars mainly used contemporary police reports and newspaper clippings, which do not talk much, as I mentioned, about the attacks on homes. However, the video testimonies of the Shoah Foundation tell a very different stories, and this is actually how I came to this topic. When I came to Southern California, to USC, I started to listen to the survivor testimonies, and when I started to listen, I kind of realized that almost all German Jewish survivors talked about the invasion of their private homes, which at the time, I had 20 years of Holocaust research on my back, I never really systematically realized. So let me share some short clips with you.
9 o'clock, my father said, I told you, nothing is going to happen. I'm going to sleep. He went upstairs. And my mother and I sat in the living room.
Somehow
and I
the
looked
video is not moving. Let me just reshare it with you. Sorry about this. This is always what happens. I hope now it works.
I told you, nothing is going to happen. I'm going to sleep. He went upstairs. And my mother and I sat in the living room, and I looked at for the last time, at huge grandfather clock, and it struck. And at that moment, it sounded like a bomb fell on the house. There was such a terrific noise, and of course now I know what it was. We had iron shades on the outside of every window.
We were at dinner, it was November 9th, of course, and it was very, very cold, and we were at dinner, and there was this horrible noise. It was just unbelievable, like the whole house was falling apart, I would say like a bomb was set off. All the windows were being broken, and they were knocking down on the door, and we really didn't know what was happening. And then Dad said, we need to get out, of the house, what are we going to do?
It was nighttime.
You slept already?
We were already in bed, yes.
What did you hear then?
We heard, we heard there was crashing all around. Obviously, something was up. And the banging on the gates of the block of flats. And poor chap on the first, on the ground floor, Jewish man, who opened the gates to let them in. He got a good bashing for not opening up quick enough, you see. So anyway, they bashed him about a bit. But he was, he wasn't badly hurt, but nevertheless he was bleeding. And then gradually, floor by floor, we heard the commotion, and we knew that we were on the list.
So it was morning?
And smashed all the crockery.
As much as possible.
Different part of these clips.
There was a whole number of people in front of the house, and they went into the first floor. That was a Jewish family, and they destroyed as much as possible. They took the dishes and took them out of the cupboards and smashed them on the floor. And I do remember one of the piano legs was in the curtain. They had a piano, and they took the piano and destroyed it, and the leg was in the curtain. So it was a terrible mess.
Well, they smashed all the crockery. They smashed all the any glass cupboards were smashed up, and bottles of any bottles of drink were smashed up against the walls, and left them covered in various colors of the rainbow.
There were 30 SR. Do you know what SR? But not in uniform. They all wore civilian clothes, but we knew them.
How did you know what they were?
Because some of them were from the village, and the rest were strangers. But when we saw the ones from the village, of course, we knew then. They had axes, and again, it was my mother who said afterwards, these axes had brand new handles, so it was prepared, because Dr. Goebbels got on the radio the next day and said, this was totally unprepared. We had nothing to do with it. The people did it. And my mother said, brand new handles for that. Anyhow, they actually hit through those iron shades everywhere. And then they broke down huge wooden front doors, and they came in. And my father came downstairs. He had put on pants over his nightshirt, and somehow I can see ourselves, the three of us, standing in the hallway against the wall. I stood on the first step upstairs, then my mother, then my father, and they came by us and started in the kitchen. Everything was demolished, broken with the axes. There was no window left.
And they go down, they start smashing things, and they start kicking over the stove, and they start smashing things, and they start everything they can. They break everything inside, everything they can possibly find, every chair, every table, everything they can find.
They cut open.
So this is, let me stop here. And so when we see these very similar sounding recollections of the violence, which come from small places as well as from big cities, it is hard to believe that this was just random violence. We know today that Goebbels told the Nazi leadership that November night in Munich that Hitler had ordered that the demonstration should succeed and proceed. But one of the attendees, the Vienna Gauleiter Odilo Bochnik, took notes that Goebbels requested drastic actions in his speech with free range for anybody aiming at the destruction of Jewish property. After the event, Goebbels drafted a circular, and we know this from his own diary, at the Nazi Party propaganda office. And in this circular, he detailed a radical course of action. While the circular has not uncovered by researchers until now, some local documents suggest that in the circular, Goebbels indeed demanded that the stormtroopers demolish the furnishings of Jewish homes. Hence, as a result, across Germany, large groups of perpetrators, stormtroopers, SS, Hitler Youth, and even some neighbors joining in, roamed villages and towns. Often, they operated on lists with addresses which were provided either by the local Nazi organization or, as in Trier, by the very city government. Let me now share some of the recently discovered picture which show the violence against Jewish homes. In Weißwasser and Bad Muskau, small towns in Saxonia, stormtroopers entered several Jewish apartments, hacked with axes the home furnishings into pieces, and threw furniture out of windows.
Wolf, excuse me, your PowerPoint is not showing. Maybe you can try again, sorry.
sorry. Oh yeah, I realize Are you seeing it now?
Yes, thank you, Wolf.
Okay. Thanks for pointing this out to me. So let me proceed. So in Geldern, near the Dutch border, the SS smashed the windows of all Jewish homes in this small place, then demolished the interior in such a way that their own report described it as leaving the home furnishings as a waste. In Mechernich, at the Belgian border, stormtroopers vandalized several Jewish homes by smashing windows and china, ripping out power cables, and stamping on clothing. Some of the intruders started looting. So let me talk a little bit about the intensity of the violence after reflecting upon the scale across Germany. The head of the Hanover police reported after the pogrom that the synagogue, the Jewish cemetery, 94 stores, and 27 apartments had been demolished. He claimed, though, that in many Jewish homes there was just minor damage to furniture or windows. By contrast, survivors from Hanover reported after the war that their furniture had been systematically hacked to pieces, and that at the central place in Hanover, Jewish household goods were burned in front of a cheering crowd. Everywhere across Germany, similar evidence is mounting, proving the severity of the destruction. And these are photos which I discovered doing my research at the Holocaust, US Holocaust Memorial Archive. In Silesia, in Beuthen, the merchant Martin Fröhlich came home in the afternoon of November 10th and found his door broken. A fallen wardrobe blocked his doorway. Entering his apartment, he must wade through knee-deep shards and rags. Everything had been smashed to pieces: glass, china, clocks, his music instruments, furniture, lamps, paintings. Realizing that his flat was inhabitable, Fröhlich felt like hit by a stroke and started crying, as he confessed in a letter to his daughter. He emphasized that the Nazis had acted worse than vandals. In Groß-Auheim in Hesse, 2 Jewish homes were vandalized after a speech of the local Nazi party leader. The perpetrators used sledgehammers to destroy everything, including lamps, radios, clocks, furniture. They spilled ink on paintings, rugs, and tablecloths, and cut blankets with glass shards. And after the war, glass and china splinters could still be found impressed in the hardwood floor of this Jewish home. In Kemp, in Rhineland, the attackers broke into the backside of the Kaufmann family home, destroyed everything on the ground floor, ripped stovepipes out, and broke doors and walls. When, as a result, parts of the ceiling collapsed, the family escaped and sought shelter in a nearby monastery. In Euskirchen in Rhineland, the home of the Horn family was totally burned to the ground, as a contemporary letter reveals. The nationwide brutal attacks on private homes did not go by totally unnoticed by foreign observers. The Swiss merchant René Jouvet encountered the home of his Jewish friends in Nuremberg with the door unhinged and water running everywhere. The handrails at the stairs and all doors had been hacked to pieces with axes. Valuable paintings had been cut with knives. The husband and his wife, the Jewish friends of this Swiss merchant, had been terribly beaten. The man died the next day in the hospital. While most of the international diplomats just denounced the burning synagogues or the vandalized stores and the mass arrests, the Italian consul general reported on November 12th that in Innsbruck, Austria, a gang of thugs with knives and iron poles intruded the apartments of the few remaining Jewish families, demolished the furniture and china, and killed 5 residents. On November 15th, the US consul in Stuttgart, Samuel Honecker, informed his ambassador in Berlin that in his region, the Jews in Rastatt had suffered the most. According to him, many had been beaten by the intruders and their apartments had been almost entirely demolished. The Swiss consul in Cologne reported to his ambassador that in Cologne, organized patrols went from one condominium to another. They threw belongings out of the windows, including gramophones, sewing machines, and typewriters. The consul underlined that still 3 days after Kristallnacht, bat feathers would still crown bushes and trees in the neighborhoods. He also mentioned that he heard from German police sources, that in Duisburg, the vandals pushed through window not only furniture, but also tenants, which cost 3 Jews their lives. As the last sources show, the destruction of private homes was frequently accompanied by murder, by beatings of their residents. Such physical attacks targeted not just men, but often also, as survivor testimonies reveal, many women. For example, in Vienna, supposedly over 1,000 Jews were hurt during the night and the next day, including many women and children. In a letter of November 20th, a Jewish woman from Vienna informed a relative, quote, "You can't imagine how it looked like at home. Everything ravaged and shattered. When the doctor came to help Papa, Hertha, and Rosa, who all terribly bled from their heads, we had no towel left to wipe off the blood." End of quote. And now I want to share a very unique series of photographs which were taken from Nuremberg by an American liberator and recently surfaced. And this series is unique because here you can see for the very first time the perpetrators in action. And you see that these match the description of the testimonies in many details. And this series is also unique because these are the only photographs we actually have of victims. These photographs were taken by the perpetrators themselves, but you see clearly how the effect of the violence, the harassment, the humiliation at this night in this private home of this Jewish family. And here are some more victims of the violence in Nuremberg apartments. And you see that they are all kind of woken up at night in pajamas, and where here in this photo you can clearly see that they were beaten up by the intruders. But not only beatings, but also sexual abuse is now emerging that accompanied the vandalism in these homes. 4 cases were already documented by the Nazi Party court itself, that SA men in Niederwern, Linz, and Duisburg either molested or raped Jewish girls that night. But not only women fell victim to sexual abuse. In Düsseldorf, a Nazi woman leader dragged a 70-year-old Jewish man to the street, and with a stick she lifted his nightgown to show off his genitals to a cheering crowd. Murder happened frequently during that night, as recorded for Lesum, Lünen, Chemnitz, Neidenburg, Heilsberg, Lichtenfels, Aschaffenburg, Munich, Nuremberg. In Bremen, stormtroopers intruded the home of Selma Swinicki and shot her to death in her own bedroom. In Berlin, 2 stormtroopers beat Willy Wurzeldorf to his death in his own apartment on the morning of the November 10th. In Cologne, 2 men entered the apartment and hair salon of Moritz Spiro. When Spiro tried to stop them from destroying his furniture, one of the intruders beat him over the head and broke his skull. He died several days later in the Jewish hospital. In Hilden, near Düsseldorf, SA and SS killed the 60-year-old mother in the home of the Wilner family. Then they left for another apartment where they knifed Karl Herz, to death, and then they returned to the Wilna flat and murdered the son, Ernst, with a bullet to his head. Many of these murders are not yet counted into our overall figure of how many Jews were killed during the events. And especially those who died several days later, sometimes weeks later in hospitals, we never really took into account when we thought about the murder during Kristallnacht. And I think here a recount and really a new assessment is very necessary to get just a kind of an approximation how many people actually were killed during this night. I think several hundred is probably way too low as a figure. So what did Jews do in reaction to the intrusion of the apartments, the destruction during that night? Thousands of Jews became homeless, as you can imagine, either because of the destruction or because in some places Nazi authorities evicted Jews from their homes and apartments. As, for example, in Vienna, Gauleiter Globotschnik ordered the eviction of many Jewish homes within 3 hours. So dozens and dozens, hundreds of Jews ended up in the streets without money or other belongings, so that the Jewish community had to organize emergency shelter. For example, 50 people were moved to an educational facility in Vienna, and 15 Jews from neighboring houses found shelter in the apartment of the head of the Jewish community, Vienna, Dr. Josef Löwenherz. In so many places, the attacks left homes inhabitable because there were no windows left, doors were broken, and this was a very cold November. As a short-term consequence, countless Jews had to seek shelter. Most often they went to relatives, either in the same town when they were lucky enough to have didn't have much destruction in their apartments, or they moved to other cities, like the Holzer family in Traunstein, who drove to Munich to live in the apartment of their relative Anna Neuberger. When Anna wrote a letter to her children in the United States on November 12th, the Holzer family added the postscript, quote, "My loved ones, as you can see, we are still with your mom. Don't worry, she's doing well considering the circumstances. We will remain here until we can return home. Of course, the best thing would be to go to America right away," unquote. Others even found shelter with non-Jewish neighbors, non-Jewish friends, or requested help from strangers. So there are some reports that foreign diplomats sheltered Jewish families in their kind of consulates or embassies. Other Jewish individuals responded in more active ways. For example, some documented the brutal vandalism by taking pictures. And the next photographs are taken by Jews, so we are clear that they were the authors of these photographs, documenting the destruction in their own homes. This is from Nuremberg. And this is a series recently discovered from Mannheim. And some Jews even dared to speak up in public and criticize the pogrom. For example, in Frankfurt am Main, Henriette Schaefer entered a shop after the violent night and referred to the attacks on the synagogues and the shops. When the store owner cited the people's rage as the cause, which was the official version of the events, Henriette Schaefer snapped and exclaimed, quote, "This is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scums, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all," unquote. After Kristallnacht, the Vienna Gestapo received a growing number of anonymous letters in which Jews criticized Hitler and the Nazi Party. To quote just one striking letter, "Dear sweet Gestapo, we will soon beat your ass. Until the German mudbrace will arrive in our ghetto alley, Hosanna to our Greenspan, the hero boy from Paris. Where now the murder frenzy unfolds, there you will soon come into a big fuss. Gun down the dog, gun down Hitler," unquote. And some Jews resisted physically during the violent events. In Peine, in Lower Saxony, SS men destroyed 20 Jewish homes. When they broke into the Marburger family apartment and started beating his father, Hans, the 17-year-old son, tried to fight them off. However, 3 SS men had no problem to overwhelm him. They dragged him to the synagogue and shot the teenager to death there. Then they used gasoline to set the synagogue ablaze. The same day, 16-year-old Daisy Gronowski from Berlin lived in an agricultural training camp in Urfeld in the Rhineland, where Jewish youth prepared for immigration. When a gang of stormtroopers raided her camp, as so many other retraining facilities, in her camp, the intruders first destroyed the furniture, then they beat up the boys, and then they started also to harassing the girls. When a stormtrooper approached Daisy Gronowski, she headbutted the guy in his stomach, employing a jiu-jitsu trick she had learned in her Zionist youth group Hashomer HaTzair in Berlin, from where she was. Using the surprise of the stormtrooper, she twisted a knife from his hand and stabbed him into his stomach. He became unconscious, which opened a window of opportunity for Daisy Gronowski to escape into the fields. She survived, making it to England. So to conclude, as you have seen with these pictures which recently surfaced, which provide the hitherto missing visual evidence about the enormous destruction of private homes of German Jews, most of these photos were taken by the victims to document the crimes in protest of the violence. After the account here presented, which is based on a much larger kind of accumulation of evidence, which I found in administrative reports, letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies, I think it is not too far-fetched to claim that the pogrom, which was dubbed Kristallnacht, deserved the name not only because of the many shattered shop windows, but the amount of broken glass and china from Jewish homes. And I know it was already mentioned that Kristallnacht is often a euphemism, and therefore many people don't want to use this, and I can go in the Q&A a little bit about the history of this term. Although the destruction of private homes was not as much visible to contemporaries as burning synagogues or looted shops, and thus was seriously underreported, these attacks were not result of random violence. They resulted from direct Goebbels orders and were thus systematic, widespread, and severe in their nature. We can only begin to fathom the enormous psychological and material toll which the violent intrusion took on the Jewish families and Jewish individuals. They witnessed the demolition of their furnishings and personal belongings and experienced humiliations, beatings, sexual violence, and sometimes outright murder. The assault on the last refuge for Jews in the Third Reich, their own privacy, meant the ultimate loss of the remaining security for so many families. And I think this mass attack on the apartments and houses, which rendered thousands of Jews homeless, might help us better explain the large numbers of suicides which followed the pogrom of November, the massive flight of Jews from Germany during the next months, and also the interesting surge of Jewish critique and protest during the following weeks after the pogrom of November. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gruner. That was indeed a very profound and a very revealing presentation from the point of view of, as you say, knowledge which is not widely known. So thank you very, very much for that. I'm now going to introduce to you Mary Clook. She is the director of the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center. And tonight she's also representing the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. Mary has kindly offered to moderate our question and answer session. Thank you, Dr. Gruner, for making yourself available for that too. Mary, there is ample time for the question and answer session, and I will simply step back and leave it to you to moderate the session as it unfolds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francois. I'm delighted to have this opportunity. Thank you. And thank you to Wolf for the most unbelievable presentation, revealing and heartbreaking at the same time. And thank you for your extraordinary research. These testimonies are hard to believe that they've been available for all these years. And through your research, you've put together a really missing piece in an important history. And we're Holocaust educators, and many of the audience here tonight will attest to the fact that we think we know a lot about the Holocaust, and then an opportunity to learn more and have this kind of detail is presented to us, and we are deeply honored and grateful for that. There have been a number of questions, and Tully asks about if you would, particularly after it was raised in the earlier part of the discussion, if you would discuss the evolving of the word Kristallnacht and the significance of it, and does it do justice to the November pogrom? If you could speak to that, please, Professor Gruner.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So the history is complicated. We knew for a long time that the term Kristallnacht was first used by German newspapers, by Berlin newspapers, then German national newspapers in the starting right in 1946, 1945, 1946, and then going on for the next years, 1949. Then in 1949, around 1949, it was picked up by English-speaking newspapers like the London Times and the New York Times. But we didn't really know who was actually who coined the term. And for quite some time, people thought this was actually coined by victims. But today, we know that the term first emerged in 1939, which is very close to the event. And it was used by a Nazi district leader in Mecklenburg in a speech in summer 1939. So it is a Nazi term. That, as already was mentioned earlier, that especially in Germany, but I think also in other parts of Europe, the use of Kristallnacht is not kind of very prominent anymore, because we, for a long time, we already kind of made the case that this is a euphemism, because so many people got murdered during that night, which a term like Kristallnacht doesn't do justice at all. And I think with my research, this actually gets, although I said there might be more explanation why it was called Kristallnacht, it doesn't still, I would subscribe that we can't call it Kristallnacht. It should rather be called pogrom, or as some German researchers recently proposed, Nazi state terror, because even when you use the term pogrom, which is usually used for Eastern Europe anti-Jewish violence, there was not such a state-orchestrated kind of framework in these Eastern European violent events. So to actually probably we need to find our own term for these heavily centralized, orchestrated terror against the Jewish population.
Thank you. That's a food for thought, and certainly something that we should all be considering. One of the questions we have, which is from Cape Town, from Linda Hackner, who runs our education department in the Cape Town Centre. She asks that she's heard the name of the pogrom referred to as the Night of the Flying Feathers, and she wondered if you had ever heard of that, the name being referred to as the Night of Flying Feathers.
No, I have not, but I think that's actually very telling, because there are certain several documents. I cited only the one Consul General, but there are several documents describing that on the one hand, how the perpetrators kind of slashed feather beds, destroyed mattresses, and then on the other hand, also describing that these feathers were flying around for days. So I think that that's very telling.
And it refers also to the fact that it was a more personal, and the feathers reflect people's personal space and homes rather than synagogues. So that is an interesting alternative name that must refer to the fact that people were aware that there had been this kind of pogrom against people's personal property and persons. Katerina is asking that she's keen to know how German civilians participated in this destruction of German homes. Surely these large-scale destructions of private homes involved many German civilians, or was it just the NSDAP members? Could you elaborate on the involvement of civilians, please, Professor?
Yes, sure. So we have ample evidence that non-party members also joined in the violence. But let me first say, we have evidence for that several Nazi party organizations participated. The stormtroopers I mentioned, SS, Hitler Youth, but also other Nazi party organizations like the Motorist Club of the Nazi party was very instrumental in the violence. Many members of them participated. And then you have civilians like neighbors joining in, sometimes non-Nazi party members who were in kind of local administrations. You have teenagers kind of joining in the violence. And then there is this kind of part also where they don't employ violence, but they are participating in looting and stealing and robbing of goods. And there you have actually a very wide range of civilians benefiting or taking advantage of the violence, because you have all these testimonies talking about neighbors grabbing the stuff which was thrown out of the windows and was still intact, who even came into the destroyed houses grabbing stuff. And there's one report which I found really stunning about a small village in Western Germany, where you first have the stormtroopers destroying the home, then you have teenagers coming in doing more damage, and then you have children robbing toys from the children's room in this home. And we know this also from other police reports, that children and teenagers were kind of involved, especially by taking stuff. So I found one police report in Berlin where a janitor in a school collects all the items from the teenagers, the fifth graders, which they brought them next day to school, which they kind of picked up on the street from vandalized shops.
Wow. The two questions from Michael Benish and Alan Mann. They both ask about the reaction of neighboring countries, for example, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, but a more general question about what was the response from the Western democracies to this pogrom in November of 1938.
So interesting is a lot of information quickly kind of was transferred to the Western countries. There were immediate newspaper report, very drastic reports the next day in very prominent newspapers. The US kind of withdraw the ambassador. So the extent of the violence and the assault onto the German Jewry was widely known. However, not all kind of governments acted kind of with more pressure. So for example, interesting is there is also a difference in reporting. The English newspapers in the UK reported about the violence, but the BBC was not. So the radio broadcast was not reporting because it was more attached to the government, which had this more appeasement approach towards Nazi Germany. So a lot of Jewish and non-Jewish organizations were reacting to the violence, but there was not much real pressure onto Germany, which I think in hindsight was a great mistake.
When you say great mistake, what would you, in terms of the pressure of what was happening at the time, what would you have expected? I'm so interested to find what you think could have been done in hindsight. We always talk about hindsight, but interfering in a diplomat in the democratically elected government of another country, I'm interested to imagine how you think they could have reacted.
I mean, I think from the very beginning in 1933, there should have been more pressure onto Germany. There was a possibility before they even left the League of Nations. There could have been more pressure from the League of Nations. There could have been more pressure from kind of foreign governments. The US was lending money to Germany, so there was a financial argument to make that they could have exerted more pressure. So there is, but there was not much more will because on the one hand, we also have to, on the other hand, we have to recognize that some of the governments, like in the US, had also sympathies to certain very right-wing kind of ideas. There was anti-Semitism, for example, in the United States, very prominent. And interestingly, one of my colleagues wrote a book about Hitler in Los Angeles, which kind of explores the Nazi movement and nationalist movement, right-wing movements in the United States, where the government didn't pay attention to at all, because they were hunting communists.
Carolyn is asking, Professor, on the photographs, if you could talk a little bit more about how they emerged. They've only become available, and your research is fascinating about putting together the testimonies, the photographs, etc. She asks about where they came, how you found them, and where they came from. Where are they available today? Where are they archived?
So yeah, this is an interesting phenomenon which kind of accompanies me doing my whole research, that always when I kind of start with one kind of element of the persecution, for example, my dissertation was on on Jewish forced labor outside of concentration camps, I always looked into photo archives to find kind of images. And there are always images kind of in these archives nobody had looked for. And often they are private photographs. And in this case, when after I realized that the testimonies from the Shoah Foundation talk in so much detail in a very similar language about the destruction, I thought, is this documented somewhere? And I couldn't find any published photograph of this. So I went to the Holocaust Museum when I had the chance to be there, to the photo archive, talked to the photo archivist and said, can you look specifically for me to find these photographs? And long story short, there were photographs in their archives for decades, but nobody had asked for them. And the same is true for other archives. Sometimes also coincidence helps us in our research. And so, for example, when 2 years ago, I organized a conference at my university on kind of for the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht, of the November pogrom. And we conveyed new research from all over the world on the pogrom. when we had the conference, the next day, there was a Twitter, somebody tweeted the photographs, this unique series I shared with you about the perpetrator and the victims from Nuremberg. Some of these photos were Twittered the next day after our conference. So I approached the person who tweeted this and asked, how did you know, where are these photos from? Turns out they were, as I mentioned, her grandfather was a liberator in the US Army who was in the intelligence unit, and he was occupying a former SS office in Nuremberg. And in this office, he found these photographs and took him with them, and they were in the possession of her family for all these decades. And she felt compelled now to share these photographs. And I would not wonder, and I would not be surprised that in other family possessions there might be other photographs. I also suspect, since this is the beginning of a research, and I just did a survey which already kind of revealed a lot, but I have to admit I didn't, because of COVID also, I could not go into German archives for this research. When I would go, I would look into recompensation files, which are plenty kind of available, plenty in German archives. And I know from some local publications that they have detailed description about the destruction of homes. And I would not be surprised if there might be also photographs in these recompensation files.
Amazing. Power of social media as well. Mark Kaplan is asking if you anticipated this new evidence when you began your research.
No, and I have to say, I mean, at the point when I watched these testimony, I had already done 20 years of Holocaust research. I had published 6 books. I was a specialist on Berlin, on several local, especially local anti-Jewish policies. I thought I knew. And when I listened to these testimonies, they changed my whole perspective in a minute. And then when I started digging, I was not really, I mean, in a way, the testimonies were so compelling that I was sure I will find stuff. But I was surprised how easy it was. And I have to kind of blame myself. I kind of looked back, revisited diaries I have read already, written testimonies from the Wiener Library, which I already had consumed decades earlier. And I just overread these incidences because it was not in our mindset that the homes were part of the kind of affected by the violence. So one thought as a researcher, oh yeah, here they mentioned the destruction of homes, but this is probably one exception of the rule. This is rather rare than common. And so we just ignored it. And I have to blame myself here.
Well, we're thanking you very much for your incredible research subsequently. Bernard Kaplan is asking an interesting question. As the years go by, there are still fresh revelations of Nazi barbarism, mainly by the many brilliant German scholars who desire genuine reckoning with the crimes of a previous generation. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I would, I mean, in a way, we always thought the Holocaust is one of the best investigated events in history, and among the Holocaust, the pogrom of November is the most detailed investigated. But with the research kind of evolving over the last 20 years, we see that we actually only at the beginning of to understand what happened. The more you dig deep, the more gaps you find as a researcher. For myself, doing this now for 30 years, focusing on this, I have more questions than answers, and which is also exciting in a way, in a very weird way. But otherwise, we could not get going to kind of deal with these horrible events if there would not be so much still to discover. And I think there will, my colleagues in, especially for example, during the last 10 years, I would say a lot comes from new research, young researchers in the occupied countries like Poland, Ukraine, France, Greece now. So there is a lot to discover, actually, what happened to how Jews were affected by anti-Jewish policies, also in very different ways. And so there is a lot of the new stuff about the participation of indigenous authorities in these occupied territories. And so we are only at the beginning to really understand how this all worked and what drove people to participate and how this affected the victims.
Professor Gruner, we've had the most unbelievable response in the chat, and that just speaks volumes about the incredible presentation that you gave. I will take one more question because it is coming to 10 to 9. But Herb Berend is saying, could you please say some more on the atrocities at Cologne? He mentions you quoted the reports of the Swiss consul who did report extensively on the Nazis in the Rhineland and whom I know having been a friend of my grandmother. It would mean a lot to Herbert if you could speak a little more on the atrocities in Cologne.
I have to say that in this way, my research is limited. As I said, I'm a one-man show. Most of my evidence, which I have collected so far, is from either reports or publications, and some also from local studies I did. Unfortunately, the local archive in Cologne is one of the less well preserved documentations in comparison to other German cities. So I personally never went to Cologne to this archive because I knew that there is not much left over from the Third Reich. So my knowledge is more kind of grounded in this diplomat report. But what I know from the report, that there are very many similarities to other German cities about the scale and the intensity of the violence. So I'm afraid I can't go into more detail there.
Thank you so much. And there have been many, many, many comments, not questions in the chat, thanking you for the most informative lecture and thanking you so much for the research, giving such a vivid graphic account of Kristallnacht on a much more personal level than we had ever understood before. Thank you so much, Professor Gruner.
No, thanks for having me. I'm glad to share this.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of a wonderful evening together. I would like to say, first of all, thank you to Mary for moderating the session, the question and answer session. Thank you again, Dr. Gruner, for your participation. Thanks to the Genocide and Holocaust Center, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you to all of you who were part of this event this evening. It is, whether we meet in real time and space, or whether we meet on the internet, in digital space, it is the participation of all of you that made this the meaningful, wonderful event that it was this evening. Please, would all of you say, and to you, Dr. Gruner, and those from other parts of the world, please be safe. Good night.